time, so we are going to get started with our panel. So thanks for joining us for this session. I really have been looking forward to this for quite some time. When we had a meeting in Seattle back in 2018, and yes, I do miss those in-person meetings, we welcomed a scholar from the Williams Institute and had a discussion on supporting trans and non-binary employees. And that event really opened my eyes as a cisgender straight woman to the lived experiences of my LGBTQ colleagues. And ever since then, we've decided that we really need to start exploring these issues in more depth. As part of our research agenda this year, we're developing a new executive briefing on supporting LGBTQ employees and families, and my colleague Kayla Vinas will talk about that a little bit more when we do our center updates. But today we wanted to start a conversation that we hope will continue and help us to develop resources and other opportunities for engagement that will make a positive impact on the growing community of LGBTQ colleagues who we work with every day. So we know that most of our members have pride networks or employee resource groups. Some have specialized health benefits and maybe even gender neutral paid parental leave. But we also know that these are not enough. Today, we're going to talk about how we can work to go beyond the basics to create a culture of belonging, appreciation, and respect for LGBTQ employees, and how to provide and support, help family members and employees navigate some of the complex challenges that life can present. So I'm very excited to introduce our two panelists for today. Jamie Bergeron is part of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusiveness Center of Excellence at EY. She leads the LGBTQ+ initiatives and is also involved in a number of community organizations like Family Equality and Collage, which is an organization of people of all ages who have an LGBTQ parent or parents. And Cheryl Catan, Vice President of Resource Development and Donor Engagement at Fenway Health, which specializes in LGBTQ healthcare, research, and advocacy. And she's also on the board of directors for the Trans Community of New England and Pride in Our Workplace. So we have two fabulous speakers to share their thoughts with us today. And I'd love it if you just got started by telling us each a little bit more about your role in your organization and what the mission of that work is. And so, Cheryl, I see you at the top of my screen, so I'm going to invite you to go ahead and share first.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Jennifer. And thanks so much for inviting me. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm honored to sort of share and to some degree represent the trans community, although that's not anything any one person can do. I'll talk about that later, probably a little bit. But my experience, Fenway Health is one of the largest LGBTQ health centers in the country. We have 35,000 patients and another 10,000 clients, so a total of 46,000 people or so that we serve. Everything from, we've been around for 50 years. And really, the organization has a very strong history in HIV and AIDS research and work and care and treatment and prevention. That part of the organization is incredibly well thought of across the globe. And then our work for the LGBT community beyond that is obviously we provide healthcare for everyone. And we believe that healthcare is a right and not a privilege. That's part of our thing. And we serve a ton of folks from all sorts of marginalized communities, not just the LGBT community. So it's a joy to work here and a great honor to serve in that way. I'm not a clinician, I'm a fundraiser, so I'm not a doctor by any stretch. And then my volunteer roles, those are the things that also bring me joy. Really very happy to contribute my nonprofit skills to various boards and various community organizations to help them raise money and help them do nonprofit management to then deliver on their mission as well.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'll go next. Jamie Bergeron, she, her pronouns. So happy to be here. Thank you so much for featuring us both and also for prioritizing this topic. LGBT family equity and equality work has been a passion of mine my whole life. Just like Cheryl, I have a personal connection to this work, being raised by lesbian parents, one of which is gender nonconforming, also being a queer person myself, and on a family building path, hopefully in the future. This work is so essential to me just because of who I am, the family I was raised in, but also the difference that I'm trying to make with my colleagues and peers at EY. As Jennifer mentioned, I work as a manager in our America's DEI Center of Excellence. I focus on our strategy and operations for firm-wide ERGs, which we call professional networks at EY. I support the sponsorship and advancement of women and racially and ethnically diverse employees at the firm. And then in this capacity, a lot of my work and time is focused on supporting our LGBT population, trans folks in particular, and supporting our people to be their full selves, their whole selves, and get everything they need to do their best work at EY. So thanks for having us.
Thank you for being here. And so you talked a little bit about your personal journey, Jamie. Cheryl, I didn't know if you wanted to say any more, what brought you to this work that you're doing?
Yeah, I shared a little bit, but I am in some ways third generation queer, which is kind of a fun thing, or at least I'm connected. My dad came out when he was probably in his late 20s, early 30s, and passed away in the peak of the AIDS epidemic. And so I sort of lived through that portion of the LGBT community through his eyes, and really, really tragic, and watched him deal with the shame and the stigma that comes not only with being, especially back then in the 70s and 80s, with being gay, but also with having AIDS. Really a lot of tragedy that I observed as a kid. And at the same time that I was observing him in that world, I was dealing with my own quiet trans identity and trying to figure out what that meant for me. And then I'm married to the same woman for 28 years. I came out to her early in our relationship. And so we always knew that there might be a time where I transitioned, and that time came just a few years ago. And I'm really, really happy about that. In the meantime, we had a couple of kids, and one of them is non-binary. So there you go, generation after generation.
That's great. Thank you for sharing with us. So let's talk a little bit about what this means in organizations. And Jamie, I'll start with you. EY has really developed a comprehensive array of supports for your employees who identify as LGBTQ. Can you talk about some of the initiatives that you have in place?
Sure, thanks. You know, there's a lot of places to start. And so what I'll start with is our employee resource groups, because I really do think that they are the crux of a lot of the work, right? It's through our employee resource groups that we find out what the most present needs and concerns are for the community and can stay really present and relevant in what resources are provided across the firm. So our Unity chapters, which exist in cities across the US and Canada, Latin America. I serve our Americas region, so focused on North and South America, but we do have Unity chapters around the globe. And those really are those local connections that our people make to one another, to mentors who are both LGBT and allies. And that's a really important part of our ERG positioning, is that they're open to all members of the firm. So we have a lot of ally engagement in our Unity chapters. A couple of the other initiatives that I think are really key are some of our external partnerships. So being able to participate and have our people participate in events like this, national sponsorships for organizations like HRC, the Trevor Project, or local affiliations with organizations like Fenway. These kinds of relationships are really key to engaging our people and often become the connection, the professional connections that our people make that give them the strength, the resources, the network to then be their full selves at work. Working through some of our national conference partnerships with our Unity members, year after year, I hear things like, this was the first time I ever met a trans person like me. This was the first time I ever met a lesbian woman who looks like me and dresses like me and has a family like mine, right? We need to also be thinking outside of our own organizations to expose our folks and allow for opportunities to network across the vast diversity of LGBT professionals that exist right outside of our own organizations. So I'll start there. Then there's all the behind the scenes resources that we focus on, all of our benefits, right? Having really robust parental leave policies, having non-gender specific parental leave policies. We have a Pathways to Parenthood resource that allows for alternative reproductive benefits to be possible. We have another resource called Pathways to Transition, which provides supplemental insurance for folks who are on a medical transition journey. You know, some of these things that aren't going to be used by everyone across the firm, but make a world of difference for those that need it are really key. And then the last thing that I'll mention are just some of the culture change and inclusion change resource and efforts that we have spent a lot of time on. One is our Ally to Advocate platform and resources. We have spent a great deal of time over the last 10 years building a community of allies for the LGBT community that knows the right language to use, knows the issues that the community is facing, has a real fluency in being able to support LGBT people as they're building their families, as they're getting promoted, as they're setting goals for their careers. And that's been really important. And then the other side of that is our trans and gender diversity education efforts. We have a really robust education effort, not only for employees at large throughout the firm, aspiring allies, but also for our talent and HR professionals to be able to really have the understanding and resources they need to support one-on-one our trans and non-binary folks who are coming out more and more. We've seen greater numbers of folks coming out in the last 5 years than we saw the 15 years before that. So this is I don't want to say a growing population because I think folks have always been there, but it's a population that's coming out and able to do so and feeling more comfortable doing so, and having the support there and being ready for that has been a really important aspect of our culture of gender inclusion at the firm. So those are just a few highlights that we're really proud of and continuing to make improvements on year to year.
That's amazing. And I think we're going to dig into some of those a little bit more as we go through our conversation. But Cheryl, I wanted to see if there's anything that you'd like to add from a workplace perspective.
I think Jamie just shared so much. I'm still digesting it. That was amazing, Jamie. The work of ERGs, I just want to put an exclamation point around what Jamie said around that. No matter what organization you're with, the emergence of ERGs as part of a corporation's culture is such a huge part of their organizational journey. Just like every individual has a journey, and your journey might have some competing parts to it, like, oh, how do I do this with my mom, and how do I deal with this with that person? And you got to sort of reconcile those. Your organization is on a journey, and it has to reconcile all these different aspects. You know, in the nonprofit sector, we want to make sure now, you know, we're more focused on equitable board representation, but we're also focused on fundraising. And sometimes those are two parts that don't always work as seamlessly as we would like them to. And so you have to work through those things. That's part of the organizational journey. That's part of, for the nonprofit sector, that's part of that journey. So I just sort of point that out. ERGs really help that happen. And the idea that Jamie talked about, that the ERGs have allies, I think one of the things that ERGs is super important. One of the things that ERGs really do, no matter what their sort of focus area is they include allies, and that creates sort of societal or cultural empathy. And that empathy is really the glue in between the policies. We have a wonderful policy about transition. I still have to use the bathroom. I still have to go to the mailroom, and that person in the mailroom misgenders me all the time. It's the cultural empathy that creates that smoothness in between the policies.
That's great. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit more in depth specifically about trans employees. What are some of the best practices for supporting them in the workplace? You mentioned the mail, going to the mailroom. You mentioned, the restrooms. What else can organizations do to support their trans employees?
Let me start, yeah. I think those examples, and you had a few others, those examples covered for medical transition, those things are super important. I think cultural competencies or societal cultural empathy around trans non-binary folks is hugely important. A lot of times it's easier for folks who don't have a lot of connectivity with the trans community to digest the idea of somebody who transitions or emerges, male to female along that binary spectrum. But for somebody who is non-binary and not on the spectrum, that's a real culturally, can be a culturally challenging thing for some employees. And so elevating that along with the sort of standard trans, I don't know, experience, I think is really good for that cultural organization. And then along with that sort of, how do we treat each other and how do we talk about folks, and having some sort of cultural understanding about that stuff, or cultural competencies around that. It's a sensitivity around what's going on for those trans folks. There's a lot more than how I present at work and what my pronouns are. That's a great place to start, but I'm in the middle of my legal transition, if I'm in the middle of my legal transition. And, that changes all sorts of things for me, including things like I've got to change my mortgage, and my credit rating goes down 50 points for a while until I can work it back up, because the credit company can't follow along with my transition as smoothly as I wish they could. Like little tiny things that tiny to us, can be really painful, especially if that person really needs that next car loan or whatever that might be. And then all of a sudden their transition knocks over dominoes that makes it tough for them to get to work. And so just understanding that it's so much more, you wouldn't draw that line directly when someone says, oh, I'm going to transition, and 3 months later, I have a hard time coming to work. But a lot of those things can be connected. So it's just listening, understanding, and just being sensitive to those types of things.
Jamie, you mentioned the pathways to transition at EY. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. One of the benefits that we have, so first of all, through our standard healthcare benefits, medical transition related expenses are covered for the most part. But in addition to that, we provide up to $50,000 of reimbursable expenses for all of the things that folks may opt into and may consider as part of their own transition journey that are often deemed cosmetic by the medical industry. And this is a real gap in insurance and medical industry and how things are tagged in the billing system, right? There are a lot of elements of transition that are not covered by standard insurance companies, but are really essential. And so being able to provide that additional support it fills that gap for our folks. And one of the things that I think is most impressive about that resource is that it's also available for the family members of our employees. So someone's partner, someone's child, and that really goes that extra mile, right? At least in our EY community, we have just as many, if not more, folks who have children that are trans or non-binary, or partners that are trans and non-binary, as we do trans and non-binary employees themselves. So thinking about your employees, but also the people that they're caretaking for, their loved ones, is really important. And I just wanted to tag on something you said, Cheryl, about some of those basics in supporting the community. this has been really present because of a lot of the anti-trans rhetoric that's been in a lot of the legislation recently, but safety is something that often we skip over paying a lot of attention to. I think especially in a professional context, we don't always take the time to consider if our folks are safe coming to work, traveling for work, going to client sites. In our capacity, we're a professional services consulting firm. So our folks are traveling, they're out, they're going to different states, they're going across the country and overseas. Thinking about the safety of folks and being able to check in with them about their comfort level traveling to states that have really strict anti-trans legislation either proposed or passed, right? Some of these elements are specific to the community and definitely need to be addressed, not just now, but always. You know, the trans community is really targeted with violence and discrimination, in particular, trans communities of color. So I think safety is always number one and should be. We can't forget about that. And then the other thing I think that just underscores everything Cheryl said and the way that we're doing our work at EY is working directly hand in hand with trans and non-binary folks to inform everything that we do is the backbone of doing the work right and getting it right each and every time. And if there aren't folks who are out or comfortable in your own organization, luckily there's lots of great external resources to leverage. There's orgs like Pride in Your Workplace, which is local to New England, that provides those consulting services and has folks available to help organizations get to the right place and inform their work so that they can create cultures where people can feel safe and comfortable to be themselves.
Do you want to comment, Cheryl?
I do. I'm glad you read my face.
Go.
That's great. So many things, Jamie. Thank you so much for bringing those up. The that $50,000 that you're talking, that was the number you said, is that right? Yeah. Can I just applaud EY for a second, because that's amazing. And what that does, what's so important to me in that is that that's equity across class. There's such a vulnerability. It's not just the vulnerability for the trans community is far beyond simply being trans. There is a cis-normative part of it. So non-binary folks are more vulnerable than someone who's cis-normative. There's a huge class, there's a huge racial thing, which we talk about the racial part of it all the time. But the ability for someone who's a vice president of an organization to deal with those cosmetic things on their own versus a person who is not a vice president at their organization having the ability to deal with those things has a direct impact on their safety and their vulnerability as they walk through life. So the idea that that's available to folks and their family, Jamie, a huge applause. I'm so impressed and excited about that. Thanks.
Well, I can't personally take credit for that, Cheryl. There's a whole community of people who work to get that in place at EY, but I do want to make myself and my colleagues available to support anyone on the call who wants to learn more about our journey and that benefit. We regularly hop on the phone and talk other folks through our journey so that you can get that benefit or advocate for adding more to what you're able to offer for your employees too. So please utilize us as a resource.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. And you did provide another resource, which I'm going to post on our member-only website that our members can access about your support for trans employees. I was wondering, building off of that, how do you help managers and colleagues when you have someone on your team who's transitioning? Is there some special support or education that's provided to help that process?
Yes, we have a liaison network, first of all, which includes myself, another member of my team, and then some of our seasoned Unity leaders who have made themselves available as resources. So we have a liaison team, but there's sort of like a domino effect that happens when somebody comes out and lets their talent professional know that they are going to be transitioning. Perhaps they're needing to take medical leave, or perhaps they're just changing their name or the pronouns that they use at work, right? And everything in between. There's a chain reaction of folks who get involved, including their talent professional, their supervisor, and myself or another liaison. And that support network centers around the person. So the person guides the support, and all we do is provide a series of options on what would make that process for them more comfortable and smoother according to their own comfort level. So let me give you an example. Let's say somebody is changing their name and is going to present differently at work in a couple weeks than they present today. We'll talk with that individual and their talent rep, invite their supervisor or team leader in if they feel comfortable with that, to discuss how they want that to go. And folks have all different ideas about how they want that to go. Some folks often want us to do a team-wide training on trans inclusion. They want to be able to tell their story and have their coming out be sort of a team belonging experience. And so we've done it that way. We have other folks who say, I don't want to draw a lot of attention to it. I just want to change my name and move forward. And we need to let their teammates know that their name has changed, and maybe some of their client relationships will start seeing a new email reflected. So there's some basic messaging that we have around that, but that doesn't make it it doesn't draw a lot of attention to the fact that this person has changed their name, right? So we let the person lead and provide a whole bunch of different options based on their comfort level. And I think the most important part to me is that they don't have to do the work. So for example, if there's a message that's going to go out to the team about a name change, they shouldn't have to write it. So we have some standard language, right, that they can edit, they can add commentary, they can share as much or as little as they want, but we have some of those resources already available for the talent professional and the individual to send the message, to say the thing, to have the conversation, so that they don't have to take on that additional communications burden around the change as they're already navigating their own change in their life.
That's great. Thank you. And we know that the numbers of people who identify as non-binary, especially in the younger generation, are growing. So even though some of our employers may not have encountered this yet, it's certainly likely to happen in the near future. Can you speak to, when there's not a singular transition being made, but maybe day to day presenting in a different way? How do you help prepare the teams for that?
Well, there's a bunch of different things. So there's non-binary, and there's folks that are gender fluid, and they might present differently day to day. And then non-binary folks, they might present differently day to day as well. But generally speaking, they're going to be comfortable in this, in their own unique presentation, whatever that is for that individual person. But it really does come down to that level of just listening to folks and understanding where they're coming from. And one of the things that I want to just sort of talk about is where folks can get additional resources. People come from all different size organizations, and it is great when you have large organizations or organizations that are centered around LGBTQ, and they have more resources and a culture that can be more affirming. And then you have smaller employers, 100 people, and they have a small number of LGBT, and their LGBT are diverse unto themselves. And so that poor, organizational head is trying to figure out, like, okay, what do I do with, I have a gay man, and I have a lesbian, and I have this non-binary person, and they're like, how do I do all this? You can get there's resources all over the place. Fenway provides a bunch. I love, Jamie, that you just put EY resources out there for folks. Pride in Our Workplace is in, Jamie, thanks for mentioning it as well, sort of functions as a global employee resource group, so that small companies, not only the president of the small company, but the employees can go there and find community and find best practices. And we have a whole host of resources There are consultants that smaller companies can bring on just for the exact work that Jamie's talking about. If you don't have that kind of an HR system where they'll write those emails for you, they'll bring that and they'll do that listening. So you don't have to be a part of a big global, very affirming company like EY. There's ways to get to those resources, even if you don't have that stuff. I don't know if that's a question you asked, but I wanted to make sure I made that point.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And we will share some of those links in the follow-up materials that we send after the meeting so people can access that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add in a little bit about supporting the growing numbers of non-binary folks. I think, one of the things that all of our organizations need to face is the way we've sort of built in gender segregation and gender binaries into our work already and challenge that, right? As we have programs that focus on the advancement of women, how have we also considered other gender diverse or gender minoritized groups of people? Have we at all? And if we haven't, how can we? How should we? And where will that get us, right? Some of the efforts that we know really work for women and advancing women in the workplace work for gender diverse people across the board, and expanding our gender strategies to go beyond women will help us be ready for the growing population of non-binary folks that are already in our workplaces, right? And continue to support the trans community that has already been in our workplaces and are people who are able to come out and feel comfortable where they are. Some of the basic things are like, are you collecting self-ID data on people across a gender spectrum? Are you building an understanding about what the options on the self-ID mean for people? Do you have a sense of who in the company has a trans experience, regardless of how they identify? If they identify as trans non-binary or trans woman or trans man, do you know who has a trans experience or not? And how might their needs be different from cis folks? These kinds of questions about how we do our work, how we support people across genders and build allyship across genders, are some of the challenges that we all need to face as our population does become more outwardly gender diverse. And I always just want to underscore, it's not that our population is becoming more gender diverse as if there was this major right turn that happened. Gender diverse people and the broad spectrum of gender identities has been present and alive and active for a really long time. It's just that gender minoritized people have been living in the shadows, and we've been forming our own communities separate and apart from our workplaces. And now we're able to be more integrated. And so it's a time for celebration and a time for those of us who are really passionate about creating workplaces that reflect our lives more, to catch up, right? And build us into the systems as they exist, or create new systems if they're not able to be rebuilt.
That's great. I really appreciate that perspective. We did have a comment from one of our members about, some of the technology, and we discussed this when we had our prep call. Some of the technology still only allows a person to choose male or female, and it's just baked into the system. And how do we go about advocating for some of those types of changes?
Advocating for those types of changes is the work that it is. It is, again, it's cultural empathy. It's helping people understand how it's important. There's also work that organizations can do that help deal with that while the organization is on its journey to fix its or to update its technology. One of the things that I point out that was a wonderful change for me that I personally experienced, and I was like really blown away by how smooth it was. It's just moving my my medical care to Fenway before I started working here as a patient, and the opening question was, I don't even know if it's the first question or the second question, but it's what's your first name, and that may or may not align with my insurance record, which is obviously what they're trying to do. They're sitting on the other side of the screen, aligning who I am. And the second question is, what is your birth date? Which allows me to say, this is my chosen name, which may, without being awkwardly put out to say like, I'm trans, this is that, and the other thing. And they just created a wonderful system. And then they coach other healthcare organizations to do that. So that's a client, or in our case, a patient-facing way to deal with that incongruency between the medical record and the presentation. But that's the same type of, you know, workaround that the organization can deal with as it comes up with. The code says male or female. It takes time to change the code. You got to advocate for it, and you got to take care of the people that are dealing with the incongruency, whatever that form is, whether that's a job application form or my time off form or whatever form it is I'm filling out.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cheryl. The advocacy word is so important because in all my years doing this work, I'm having the same conversations about systems change today that I was having 15 years ago. The systems do not do a great job of reflecting people. So collecting information on identities can be really hard, and it's going to be a challenge until the providers catch up with the rest of us. That said, we can advocate in our own organizations to put pressure on our vendors and our providers. You may be held within a contract time period, but when that contract is up, the provider can provide customizations. How much will that cost? What time frame are they able to make the updates within? What will be needed from the organization to provide in order to make that happen when the contract is up and the time is right? So some of it is just planning. It's doing the business of planning with your vendors so that they're providing you with the resources that your organization needs, and making it a non-negotiable. In order for us to continue working with you, vendor, this is what we need. And getting the buy-in from leadership to be able to have those hard conversations, and then also getting the support from the ally and LGBT communities within the ERG or throughout the organization it will help support the leadership in their own advocacy in those vendor relationships to update the systems. But really, it just is a business imperative, regardless of the feelings that the LGBT community within your organization has. We are hiring and recruiting LGBT people constantly, right? And your systems have got to reflect the population that you're hiring if we still want to be around in 10 years, 5 years, 20 years. So it's a business imperative. It also helps people feel like they want to stay at your organization when they see themselves reflected. And so that's another one of those bottom line arguments that can be made.
So articulate. I think you're both such amazing advocates, and it would be great to take you out on a road show, I think, to share some of these insights. I did want to switch gears a little bit and talk about how people are building their families when they want to become parents, and how that process can be more challenging for LGBTQ employees. So can you talk a little bit, I know you mentioned the pathways to parenthood, talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, happy to. So our Pathways to Parenthood resource, it was implemented in 2016, and it's 16 weeks of paid parental leave that's gender neutral. And so the reason that it's gender neutral and not maternity leave, it's parental leave, is to be inclusive of all family types, however people build them. So that leave is not just following the birth of a child into the family, but also adoption, surrogacy, foster care placement, legal guardianship. So just really understanding the diversity of families that exist within your organization, and having your parental leave policies reflect that, so that a family who is adopting a child is not having a different experience than a family that is giving birth.
related to support, which might be financial or medical for people who might be developing their families in a different manner. I know EY has some very robust benefits there.
Yeah, so very similar to our Pathways to Transition benefit that allows for $50,000 of supplemental reimbursements. We have a similar benefit through Pathways to Parenthood, up to $50,000 of supplemental reimbursements for assisted reproductive technology procedures, including fertility-related drugs that folks may need to use, egg or sperm preservation or freezing, surrogacy or adoption costs. So for many people, whether they're LGBT families or not, there is a need for additional assistive reproductive technology to build a family. And so wanting our people to be able to have that opportunity, we're able to provide this Pathways to Transition benefit for folks. And since 2016, we have reimbursed more than $12 million for our Pathways participants. So folks are utilizing this resource. It's making a big difference in their ability to live a full and balanced life as EY employees. We're very proud of it.
Anything you'd like to add, Cheryl, to that?
I think that is just so wonderful. I am learning so much from Jamie. It's so great. One of the things I just add, by doing that, it really is about family equality is really what you're talking about. And there's families where the parent is trans and they are banking their sperm before they transition. There's all sorts of stuff that, again, I just sort of added nuances to any given experience. And that, that's a unique trans thing, but there's also, all over the place for straight cis couples, all sorts of folks are needing these types of services. I think that's wonderful that you provide that type of support.
One of the topics that we've been focusing much of our time on this year is mental health. And we know that the LGBT community is disproportionately affected. They face discrimination and adverse incidents. Can you talk about how organizations can provide more culturally appropriate or sensitive support for mental health?
Jump in, Cheryl.
I'm not in HR, so I'll end up talking about things from a much more personal of my experience, here at Fenway, the LGBTQ youth that we have in shelters and that we are providing medical care for because they don't have any other parent that's helping them get their medical care. It's really an amazing thing to think about in Massachusetts, where we think of ourselves as such a progressive state that we have so many kids that are literally experiencing homelessness because of their sexual or gender identity. It is, it's just so tragic. And on top of that, the cultural issues around the legal concerns that people are creating out of political need or political desire, whatever that is. Sorry. That adds to the mental health concerns for these kids in particular, but really for the LGBT community. You might say, like, people, it's not in my backyard, it doesn't impact me, it's just politics, it's just whatever it is, it makes business sense, whatever people want to sort of justify it as. If you're saying that, you're exercising a certain level of privilege, because those folks who are impacted, that if you're a 13-year-old kid who is in the middle of coming to terms with your own identity, and the governor is saying, that we do not value you, it is very hard not to take that personally. That is not a political statement, that is a personal statement. Mm-hmm. And you can feel that in their day-to-day breath that they take. So those organizations that are dealing, us and others that are dealing with kids in that exact space, and adults that are dealing with that, on top of the strain in the behavioral health, mental health community right now around providers and around increased need because of the pandemic, it really is a crisis of significant proportion that just needs to be put a spotlight on. So thanks for doing that. And then what we can do is support, I mean, lots of different things. And I'm sure Jane will have some great practical stuff, but it really is supporting those organizations that are doing that hard work and being empathetic about what's going on.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cheryl. I'll just add a couple things. Cheryl made the great point earlier that there are organizations of all sizes on this call. And so while, many major organizations have really robust mental health resources, EAP programs that are able to be provided and should be highly advertised for folks. And we can advocate for those providers to be LGBT culturally competent and have the awareness, knowledge, and skills to specifically support the LGBT community. That works really well for organizations that have that infrastructure. For orgs who don't, that are maybe smaller or nonprofit orgs, there are so many free resources that are not highly advertised or publicized within professional spaces and should be. So for example, the Trevor Project has a great suicide hotline that should be promoted. The national suicide hotlines should be promoted. These are resources that LGBT people use all the time and are really valuable. And there are culturally competent providers on the other ends of those phones who know how to support people in their most dire moments. So I just want to draw attention to that. And then in addition, some of the other great organizations that have lots of free resources are PFLAG, Gender Spectrum is another one, HRC, of course, Human Rights Campaign is another one, Out and Equal, another one. So all of these organizations have a lot of free and readily available mental health resources. So there's no absence of materials out there. But I also just want to underscore the importance of relationships and breaking isolation for folks where it's possible to build a culture around checking in with one another, having supervisors pay attention to what's happening in current events and checking in with individuals or the whole team around what's happening in the world, right? Over the last few weeks, as there's been so much anti-LGBT rhetoric and anti-trans rhetoric in the news, a lot of folks that have come to me and said, hey, nobody's asked me how I feel and I can't even sleep.
Mhm.
Right? So just understanding the weight of the world that people carry with them at work every single day when the world around us is not affirming, accepting, supportive is breaking that isolation is so important. Just having other people know what you're holding can go a long way. I know it goes a long way for me, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is just connecting people to one another. So I mentioned that we have unity chapters across the US, but there might be just one trans person in one unity chapter. There might just be one bisexual person in one unity chapter. There might just be one mom with a trans child in that unity chapter. So folks need to be connected across. And so whether you can do that within your own organization or to external groups, getting people connected to other people who are having the same experience, even if it's just one other person, can go a long way in helping people feel less alone, less isolated, and that they have just that baseline level of support to keep going when their mental health is suffering or they're facing a crisis.
That's great information. Thank you. I just building upon the issue of parents who might be in our workplaces and don't know where to turn for support if they have a child who is either identifying as LGBTQ or not sure where they're at in the moment. Are there special groups or support available to those parents who are valued employees too?
Yeah, I'll put in the chat the name of an org called Gender Spectrum, which is specifically for a community of parents and caregivers with trans and non-binary kids in particular. And then of course, PFLAG for parents and caregivers of LGBT folks broadly. And Collage, COLAGE, is a community of folks whose parents have come out. And within the Collage community, the largest growing population of children and adults whose parents have come out are people with trans and non-binary parents. So on both sides, right, there's support for parents of trans and non-binary kids and kids with trans and non-binary parents.
Right on.
Anything else you want to add to that, Cheryl?
I'm going to put a couple of resources in there as well, both from Fenway. We have a whole group of support groups, a whole pile of support groups that people can come to. You don't have to be a patient, you can go. And then I'll also put a whole ton of resources that are really geared for their lesson plans. They're really geared for healthcare, but an astute HR person could certainly grab these. They're free. There's 250 of them. And think about the cultural competencies and just make some quick adaptations to your own industry, and you'll be able to use them as you're teaching and coaching folks. The other thing, just to put a real exclamation point, I'm so glad, Jamie, that you talked about it goes, both ways. Those parents of trans kids, they need a ton of support. One of the most powerful support groups I've ever seen was straight cis dads of trans girls. And I didn't go into that room necessarily, but I was there and sort of welcomed them in. And then I was there at the end when they came out. But these guys were so appreciative of the ability to lean on each other. And they love their kids and they don't know how to express that love. And they really didn't feel comfortable even going to a therapist, but they could talk to another guy who's in the same thing. And they would say, my kid is in 3rd grade and my kid's in 2nd grade. And they would talk about that and they would come out feeling more comfortable saying, my daughter is in 2nd grade, my daughter is in 3rd grade. It's a huge moment for those guys. So that idea of ending the isolation and connecting people with even one other person is hugely important.
That's great. Thank you so much. And our time is running out here. I'm noticing, and there are so many more things that I'd love to talk about. If anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I did want to talk a little bit more about the political climate out there right now. And I know when we spoke, Jamie, you had told me that there are over 150 pieces of legislation, a lot anti-trans, but even anti-LGBTQ around the country. And I was wondering what you see as the role of our organizations in being advocates and getting the word out there.
Yeah, I think it's more important now than ever for the business community and just professional community at large to come together. HRC currently has a business coalition that they're putting together. If your organization can sign on to that and become a part of that effort, I think that's a great first step. I also think if organizations or their leaders are able to be involved in local legislative advocacy efforts in any way, it's really important. I mean, the attacks on LGBT people, trans folks, and LGBT families have just become astronomical, really, post-federal gay marriage legislation. And it continues to just take different forms, right? All the bathroom bills that we saw come out a couple years ago, we're now seeing in the form of banning trans kids from sports or banning the teaching of LGBT-specific content in schools. So it's just the anti-LGBT legislation and rhetoric is just taking different forms, but it's the same kind of rhetoric. And our organizations really do need to take a stand because it's the right thing to do, of course, and also it's impacting our people and our ability to live whole, full lives and be productive at work when we don't know if we'll have what we need to survive, right? So it really is a human rights issue. It really is a people first modality to take that stand and be able to stand up for what's right as an organization and do the culture change work to get everybody on board. If it's an organization where that's not the case, it's going to take time to get everybody on board, but it doesn't mean that a company, a large company, a middle-sized company can't take steps to be public advocates while also doing the culture change work. And I want to make that point because sometimes folks say, well, our organization would never because our people aren't supportive. Let's figure out how to work both ends of it, right? So that we can get farther faster.
Cheryl, anything you'd like to add as we wrap up?
I'd say, well, I have a whole bunch of things I want to say, but thanks again for asking me to be here. The federally qualified health centers, of which Fenway is one, who serve the LGBT community. There's about 13 of them across the country. And we have a geographic and cultural community that we serve. We serve all folks regardless of their ability to pay. That's one of the defining qualities of a FQHC. And so we are binding together across the country so that as those states manifest either the fear or the actual laws about being able to provide gender affirming care, these 13 federally qualified health centers are finding ways to literally fly these kids up to, out to LA or up to Boston or into New York to get their care, until we can also work from an advocacy perspective to get those things rolled back. It is a real significant crisis that takes a lot of folks to work on. So there's just a lot of things going on for organizations to do. I want to say one other quick thing that's super important. I'm super happy to represent the trans community in this moment. I am not representative. Most folks in the trans community don't have the privilege that I have. Most folks, folks in the trans community are generally underemployed and don't have these types of resources. And then to have these legal things put upon them, it's so great when they can work for a company like EY and they can have that sort of affirming experience, but that is not the standard, and neither am I. We are outliers in our world right now.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your voice. I see a lot of words of appreciation in the chat. And I'd love to continue this conversation with both of you and stay connected, and just truly appreciate your time and being so candid and such fabulous advocates. So I hope everyone will join me in thanking Jamie and Cheryl today.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for the invitation, and thank you everyone for joining in this conversation. I would love to have it be an ongoing conversation and build a network so that we can all keep progressing in our own organizations and communities. And so happy to be here with you, Cheryl, as well. You're such an accomplished and inspiring person to be in community with. So I'm proud to be on this panel with you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Thanks to everybody. I really, really appreciate it. I do hope that our paths not only cross virtually, but I hope that they cross the street like later today. I really want to say hi to everybody and really get to know folks on a more personal level. So I hope that happens. Thanks.